Hello everybody and welcome. I'm very happy to be here. Fascinating idea of bringing together composers and performers of early music. Tu sei morta, one of the emotional, I can't say high points because it's a terrible low point, it's a tragic moment where Orfeo has finally grasped that Eurydice has died, and the continuo play a G minor, definitely a sad and serious chord, and they do not dance, they just stay still, just like Peri says, and nothing happens. Orpheus is acting a very human response to just incomprehensibly bad news. On his wedding day, his bride has died. And finally he manages to say, tu, you, and there's a gap there as well. Sei morta, you're dead. It's a brilliantly notated record of how a good actor would deliver lines like this in a situation like this. And really all I have to say is, so is every single instant of the speech that follows. The continuo after those words just crash down to a low D. And they try again, but the continuo are hardly moving. The harmonies are very fixed. There are, for ages, no six chords. Everything is root position. Tends to be in this style anyway. But there's no movement, there's no cadences. It's just a block chord. We are stuck here. Perfect representation of the emotional situation. And then, as Orfeo resolves to take some action to make the journey into hell, the bass itself begins to move, and tortured chromatic shifts, all the things you would want. This is a very hot topic in early music at the moment, and in music in general, when we say gesture and we say musical gesture, different people mean different things. So in modern day music psychology, music gesture is all the stuff that performers do, all the body movements they make that are part of their habit of performing. And my goodness, early musicians do a lot of those. Just go and watch all those videos of violinists with these movements. It was brought from Germany to London in the late 1970s and 80s, and it's very much part of this is what we do with early music. And there's the accent. Recorder players have a whole vocabulary of circles that they do. Somebody should write a history of where that comes from. So musical gesture in modern psychology is all the movements that we make when we're doing music. In early music, some people, especially harpsichord players, use musical gesture to mean turning a few notes of music from raw notes into something that captures the ear, that captures the imagination, that could be emotionally effective. This is a lovely idea. If you simply mean by that, play these notes out of time, then I'm not going to agree with you because the sources don't say that. But if you're going to say something like, exaggerate the rhythmic contrasts inside a regular tactus, I'm with you all the way with this idea of turning the raw notes into something living, crisp, chiseling out the syllables when there are words, chiseling out the rhythms if you're an instrumentalist. And there's a really historical thing, we call it today Baroque gesture. At the time they called it action. And this is what you do with your hands when you're speaking or singing. It includes what you do with your face and your eyes, the way you stand. But as you'll see from the Caravaggio picture on the left, pointing is a big part of it. And then look at all those facial reactions. And look at the way that the point of the person on the right of the picture directs the viewer's attention to what is being pointed at, as do the lighting effects. And if you think Caravaggio was good with lighting, then just think how good they were on the Baroque stage. And then this, one amongst very many examples, but this gesture for pay attention, which we see in gesture books like Bulwer's book from 1644, but we also see it in paintings. This was a recognized language of the use of the hand and indeed the whole body. And it's not just the hand, it's the whole body. So if we look at this lovely picture, it's Bacchus who's drunk at the back and Arianna who's crying in the front, but she's going to be crowned as a queen, and Amore, Cupid, is there in the front with his bow and arrows. And actually the only person who's doing an actual Baroque gesture is the shepherd, who's making a sort of compassionate gesture as he speaks to Arianna. She has her finger drawing a tear from her eye. So that's a kind of Baroque gesture, but it's more the shape of the body positions, the direction of the gaze, all those things. And then just look at Bacchus himself. I mean, you know, there's no Baroque gesture with the hands there, but he's got a big goblet in one hand and an even bigger flask full of wine in the other hand, and he's clearly already had plenty to drink. And so he's showing a very, very clear story in gesture, but not limited to the hand gestures that we tend to think of. So my personal compositional methods, this is particularly as I was working on this remake of Arianna. I started from the text, the libretto, and all the other historical documents I could find. There's a lot of description of Arianna. This idea of decorum, that everything fits together. Shakespeare said it this way, that the actions should suit the words suit the action. Action is everything that happens on stage, the telling of the story, but action is also the way you act with your body. Who is speaking? Different people speak in different ways. Aria, looking for elements of repetition, especially rhythmic repetition. Those elements give the excuse for music, because with repetition, words sometimes behave so strangely. And we need aria in an opera. We can't leave the audience just with... The original Arianna was 2.5 hours, so was mine. We can't leave them with 2.5 hours of quote-unquote recitative. We need the delight of song. Also charming ensemble music. Structuring my composing from the bass upwards. And then to find what the singers should do, I simply spoke the texts, declaiming them out loud, as if in a big hall for 1,000 people. Sometimes I was in a train or an aeroplane, so I had a lot of amused looks from my fellow travellers. But I declaimed every single line of the original libretto, and I declaimed it with historical gestures. Citations, this idea that if there's a word that you already know, it's going to be spoken the same way. This is the signor idea. And then, because I had this job of trying to remake Monteverdi's 1608, but now lost masterpiece, I just preloaded my subconscious, because in the end creativity is the bringing from the subconscious into the conscious mind of what you're creating. And so I preloaded my subconscious with an awful lot of Monteverdi's best music from around this time, either side of the year 1608. So looking to our case study from Arianna, and there's one particular place, it's the third line of the music. So lampeggio is a lightning strike. Lampeggio! Flashing down. When I first sketched this, I knew it had to flash, but I wrote it upwards, and then afterwards I realised, no, lightning has to flash downwards. And actually, when you look at the Baroque settings, they nearly always have their settings of lampeggiare, the lightning flashing, coming downwards. But this is a difficult line because it says, out of the deep sea come the nymphs and shepherds. And so they're coming out and upwards. So on the word out from, if war, I wanted to write something upwards, but then since the last words are out of the deep sea, it has to be something low. And again, in my first version, I wrote it all going upwards because that's the way they were going. But when I did it with gestures, I realized if I went, and out of the deep sea, with an upwards gesture, my hand was ending up really high as I'm saying deep sea. That's not decorum. That's not everything fitting together. So that had to be changed. So now, in the last verses of this speech, the messenger who's telling this very passionate, happy story tells us to listen to the heavens. And with this idea of heavenly music, this is an excuse for aria, for repeating structures, for more and more song-like writing. And so I took the ground bass of Chacona, real party music, and used that as the basis for a musical aria, although he's talking about sound, but he's not actually singing, in the sense that on stage this is still a representation of speech, but it's a speech that has become more and more rhythmic and song-like, and listen to the heavens on a high note, and even repeating words, my friends, little elements like this that come out of the emotions then suggest repeating structures, which is what we call aria, which is then what we would nowadays call aria, song-like material. Doni was a theorist, and he was quite critical of some of the aspects of this new style of music drama. In particular, he was critical of the style which makes up a lot of this acting style, recitativo, acted music, where it's not just speech. It's got a little bit too much musical interest and a little bit too much delight to be just dry speech. But it's also not a formal, structured aria. And he felt that this thing just sort of didn't really belong. It's like, for him, either just speak, or if you're going to sing, then sing some real music, and not this in-between thing. And he was not alone in having that feeling. So even some of the most beautiful pieces we have, for example, Peri's Eurydice, beautifully expressive telling of the Orpheus and Eurydice story, but some audience members weren't sure how to listen to this new style, and the only comparison they could think of was that this singing storytelling was like the chanting of the Passion at in Holy Week in church.
The Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ according to John. After they had eaten the supper, Jesus went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers, together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them,
"Whom are you looking for?"
And they replied,
Jesus of Nazareth.
Jesus answered,
"I am he."
So they perhaps wanted more delight and less storytelling. And this is really the dilemma for a composer writing opera, is how to combine musical delight with the suspension of disbelief that somehow the characters on the stage are not singing, they're doing something musical with their voices, which is nevertheless representing speech. It's probably easier for us today because we've got centuries of different kinds of music dramas, and we're prepared to suspend disbelief quite a lot. So we don't even mind something like The Sound of Music, where in the middle of the story, Julie Andrews just starts to sing a song. It's a song. There's just no pretense that it's not a song. Sometimes it's in a semi-realistic setting, but other times it's just, okay, it's time for a song now. You know, in our show, now we finish with the speaking part, it's time for a song.
They have sung for 1,000 years. The hills fill my heart with the sound of music. wants to sing every song it hears.
And modern audiences are quite happy to accept that. Other audiences in other styles and at other times, and certainly in the early 17th century, was struggling with this idea. And what seems like the best solution, a style which is speech-like but is still musically delightful, perhaps intellectually is unsatisfying. I don't know. I'm not Doni. Personally, I don't agree with him. I rather like this musically attractive but still speaking style. And perhaps he was bothered more academically than orally. Who knows? So there were real songs. There was this in-between style which Doni doesn't approve of, but actually there's a lot of it. And to my ears it sounds attractive. The styles he did approve of was the expressive style, so not just dramatized, but really expressive, where there's so much emotion that we have to go beyond ordinary speech. This is the area where Doni felt that music really came into its own. And then he also recognized another type of recitative, narration. And the cue for narration was to begin all on one note. Let me tell you a story. This again evoked the storytelling in the Passion services in Holy Week. And it's a code that tells the audience what follows is going to be narration rather than dialogue. And in Monteverdi's Orfeo, we have a wonderful moment of narration that is also very expressive. The messenger who has come to tell Orpheus that Eurydice has died, she starts off with expressive music. Ay, gods, what terrible! Oh, what a terrible thing! With passionate harmonies and pitched high in the voice with her desperation. And then she changes to this narration style as she begins to tell her story. In a flowery meadow, speaking on a monotone, once upon a time, gives the audience the clue this is going to be the story, this is the narration. The narration becomes very expressive, and here we're far from that easygoing, delightful sound of the dramatized speech, dramatized into music, thing that is very attractive but Doni was uncertain about. Here we're really in the strong areas of narration and expressivity. And perhaps the most emotional moment, where Orpheus has gone into hell, the wedding day is a disaster, Eurydice is dead, and now what does this messenger do? She was just the messenger, but everybody hates her. She has nowhere to go, and so like a dark owl, an unlucky omen, she's going to crawl off to some cave where she can live a life that suits her sadness. Monteverdi writes amazingly expressive and sad music, and comes to an emotional climax on the word dolor, sadness. Everything fits together, conforme, it conforms, it fits. This is the rhetorical idea of decorum. But notice that this word conforme, fittingly, suitably, it's not an emotional word. The emotion was, "I will lead a life of sadness," appropriately. And in the music, the long notes, the tortured chromatics, it's all finished, and conforme is just an easy cadence, which, according to the instructions from Marco da Galliano, the singer already makes the accent on the last word. Conform, she's already gone. This is a very much misunderstood moment in modern performances, where the actress doing the part of the Messaggiera wants to get every moment of tragedy from her final words, and so she should, up to the last tragic word, dolor. But as she says, fittingly, suitably, she should suitably already be exiting. And so there's a warning here for performers not to put false emotion into ordinary words. Put the emotion where it belongs. And there's a warning to composers. Don't try to compose emotion into ordinary words. Be honest. In that sense, be authentic. Monteverdi was recognised in his own lifetime as the master of conveying emotion in music drama. How did he do it? He insisted on high quality text, and then he set that text to music by notating the way it would be spoken by a great actor. He was influenced by poets and producers and by performers. A lot of what we see in the score is actually already structured in the libretto. And so I said, the score is not the music. The performance and what the audience receive from the performance, that's the music. But it comes from a score, and that score itself comes from the performance of spoken drama. So if you're a composer and you want to write opera, what about going to see a lot of spoken drama and seeing how great actors speak? This was Monteverdi's way to create the score from which his performers created music which moved the emotions of his audiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was super interesting and a lot of ideas, at least to my mind. There's a lot of, if we think about the text and the use and how Monteverdi was using the text, and there's a lot of contemporary composers who are analyzing the text really deeply,
yes.
Really this sonological way, you know.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting how those things are actually coming together somehow, this sort of wow effect.
Yeah.
I mean,
and of course Arvo's way of working with text, which is not always a conventional way of expressing the text, but it may be that some element of the text suggests the deep structure of the music. It's this.
And listening this example of the text that was in your presentation, it really reminded sort of Steve Reich, like it's gonna rain. This sort of like a very contemporary visit that you really start to listen in samples, and it's like, okay, here we are talking about certain fragments of text, but if we talk about the music technology, we talk about samples, and but it's very, very similar attitude, and then how you're starting to notice the musical side of it. So there is very interesting kind of connections that are coming.
And I think this connection was there in the early 17th century too, because poets collected short samples. They collected individual lines. It might not even be a complete sentence, but a line of poetry. They would just pass them around and appreciate individual lines and comment on them. And then they would also quote their own and other poets' individual lines in their larger works. So you have a lot of cross-referencing. We found a lot of it, but there must be much more that we just simply haven't recognised yet. And again, it's this thing of repeating and cross-referencing and sampling. Yeah, I think it's very powerful.